They called it an open and shut case. One victim, one suspect, one story clean enough to fit inside a 2-minute evening news segment. The press conference sounded confident, controlled, final. Justice had been served. The public was told. The danger was gone. The system had worked exactly as it should. But there's something strange about certainty, because long after the cameras shut off, long after reporters packed away their microphones, small questions began to surface. Questions that didn't belong in a solved case. A witness who insisted investigators ignored her. Evidence logged, then quietly forgotten. A confession that sounded convincing, until someone finally listened to the full recording. And when those pieces are placed side by side, something unsettling begins to appear. Not a single mistake. A pattern. Tonight, we're going to examine 3 cases declared solved by authorities, cases presented to the public as finished stories. And we're going to slow them down, piece by piece, because sometimes the truth isn't hidden by secrecy. Sometimes it disappears simply because everyone stops asking questions at the same time. These are the hidden truths uncovered when you stop listening to the headlines and start listening to the evidence. If you've ever watched a press conference and felt that quiet thought in the back of your mind, something about this doesn't tee it up, you're not alone. And tonight, we follow that feeling wherever it leads. You're watching Arcane Echo, True Crime. Here, we don't chase shock value or rumors. We follow timelines, documents, recorded words, and the small details that often matter more than the loud conclusions. Because understanding how cases fall apart isn't about blaming individuals. It's about understanding systems and how even well-intentioned investigations can drift away from the truth. Tonight's episode explores investigative failures using verified patterns drawn from real cases. Some identifying details have been changed to protect privacy while preserving the investigative realities behind them. Let's begin with the question that connects everything you're about to see. Why do cases that seem airtight sometimes collapse years later? Every major investigation begins the same way. A crime shocks a community. Fear spreads faster than facts. Rumors multiply. News cycles demand answers immediately. And investigators face enormous pressure not just to solve the crime, but to restore a sense of safety. Because uncertainty is terrifying. Closure, even imperfect closure, feels comforting. So within days, sometimes hours, a narrative begins forming. A suspect is identified. A motive is proposed. A timeline is assembled. And once that story exists, something subtle happens. New information stops shaping the story. Instead, the story begins shaping how new information is interpreted. Psychologists call this confirmation bias, the human tendency to favor evidence that supports an existing belief while minimizing information that contradicts it. In investigations, this doesn't always look dramatic. It looks procedural. A witness statement labeled low priority. A forensic inconsistency explained away as an anomaly. An alternative theory quietly left unexplored. Individually, each decision seems reasonable. Together, they can redirect an entire case. Over time, investigators may stop asking, "What happened?" and start asking, "How do we prove what we already think happened?" Tonight, as we examine 3 cases, keep 3 warning signs in mind: the rushed narrative, the missing voices, and the evidence that raises questions instead of answers. Once you learn to recognize these patterns, you begin to see them everywhere. Our first case begins with a witness who slowly disappeared, not from reality, but from the official story. On a freezing winter night in 2012, a young woman we'll call Emily Hart left a neighborhood bar after midnight. Witnesses described an argument with her former boyfriend earlier in the evening, emotional, but not violent. Hours later, Emily was found dead several miles away. The discovery stunned the small town. Within 48 hours, police announced an arrest. Her ex-boyfriend. The motive seemed obvious. The timeline appeared clean. News outlets repeated the phrase investigators used repeatedly: a crime of passion. To the public, the story made sense. And when stories make sense, People stopped looking deeper, but buried inside early interview notes was a statement that complicated everything. A bartender reported seeing Emily leave the bar, not alone. She described another man walking beside her, someone she did not recognize. That detail never appeared in the final case summary. According to internal correspondence released years later, the statement was categorized as non-essential. Non-essential, a single word capable of reshaping a case. Because once investigators believed they understood what happened, contradictory information became noise instead of evidence. Months passed. The bartender attempted to repeat her account publicly. Then she stopped speaking altogether. Neighbors later said she felt pressured, overwhelmed, afraid of being wrong, or worse, ignored again. Eventually, she moved away. Her name faded from reporting, and on paper, it became as if she had never existed. This is how witnesses vanish. Not through conspiracy, but through prioritization. When systems reward certainty, convenient voices slowly lose oxygen. Years later, forensic reviews uncovered another complication. Fibers found on Emily's clothing did not match her ex-boyfriend's home or vehicle. Soil samples indicated contact with the location inconsistent with the prosecution timeline. Each discrepancy alone seemed minor. Together, they suggested an uncomfortable possibility. Someone else may have been involved. But by then, the case already had closure, and reopening certainty is far harder than creating it. This brings us to the first hidden truth. When a case becomes a story, evidence that challenges the story often stops being pursued. And that pattern appears again even more clearly in our second case. Confessions are powerful. To juries, they feel definitive. After all, why would someone admit to a crime they didn't commit? The answer is complicated and deeply human. In this case, a small business owner was found murdered after closing his shop. Police quickly detained a young man with minor prior offenses who had been seen nearby. After hours of questioning, investigators announced success. He confessed. The headline spread instantly. Case closed. But years later, court order released the full interrogation recording, and the tone was very different from the transcript. The questioning lasted nearly 10 hours. Investigators repeatedly suggested what might have happened. They implied cooperation would help him go home sooner. They presented hypothetical scenarios, slowly guiding responses. Finally, exhausted, the suspect said, "I guess I must have done it." If that's what you're saying in isolation, it sounded incriminating. In context, it sounded uncertain. Critically, the suspect never provided details only the killer would know. No hidden weapon location. No unreleased forensic detail. No independent confirmation. Yet the statement became the centerpiece of the case. This illustrates a second hidden truth. A confession can feel convincing even when it contains no new information. Under stress, sleep deprivation, and authority pressure, people sometimes agree with narratives simply to escape the situation. The confession solved the case publicly, but privately, unanswered questions remain. And once again, momentum replaced investigation, which leads us to the most unsettling example of all, a case where the missing element wasn't a person or a statement. It was the evidence itself. In the mid-2000s, detectives investigating a homicide assembled a supplemental binder. Inside were alternative leads, tip-line reports, and early suspect theories. Years later, a new detective reopened the case. He requested the supplemental file. It could not be located. No destruction record, no transfer log, no digital copy, just absence. Former investigators recalled the file containing references to a suspicious vehicle never mentioned publicly, along with notes linking the crime to a similar case in a neighboring jurisdiction. Without the file, those leads effectively ceased to exist. This wasn't necessarily malicious. Sometimes systems fail quietly. Departments change storage policies. Budgets shrink cold case units. Physical archives deteriorate. But the result is the same. Information dies. And when information disappears, possibilities disappear with it. The third hidden truth is perhaps the hardest to accept. Justice doesn't always fail through dramatic corruption. Sometimes it fails through ordinary neglect. So what should viewers take from stories like these? You're not investigators. You don't have access to evidence rooms or interrogation transcripts. But you do have something powerful: questions. Here's a simple mental checklist you can use whenever you encounter a solved case. First, listen for speed. If a suspect appears almost immediately, ask what alternatives were considered. Truth often takes time. Narratives appear quickly. Second, track missing voices. Notice witnesses mentioned once and never again. Absence can be as meaningful as presence. Third, examine the magic words: confession, closure, solved. Ask what evidence supports those claims independently. You don't need expertise to recognize patterns. You only need patience. Some cases remain unsolved because answers are genuinely unknown. Others become solved because questioning quietly stops. Tonight, we saw 3 different paths away from certainty: a witness who faded from the record, a confession shaped by pressure, a file that vanished into bureaucracy. Each case reminds us of the same idea: truth is rarely destroyed all at once. More often, it erodes slowly, decision by decision, assumption by assumption, until only one version of events remains. If you've stayed with me this long, nearly an hour into this investigation, you already understand something important. Curiosity is not cynicism. Asking questions isn't disrespect. It's how justice improves. So tell me in the comments, which case unsettled you the most? And have you ever followed a case where the official explanation didn't feel complete? Subscribe to Arcane Echo, true crime, for deeper investigations into the stories that refuse to stay buried. Because sometimes the loudest evidence is what the silence leaves behind. I'm Arcane Echo, and until next time, keep listening to what the silence is trying to tell you.